My Lords, it was a real pleasure to hear earlier the Noble Baroness Lady Pigeon's maiden speech. We overlapped for 8 years on the London Assembly, and I can guarantee your Lordship's house you have seen the softer side of her today. When I was introduced to the House, they found it difficult to find anyone who knew me because I was a London representative. But the Noble Lady Hamwi spoke up for me, and she said about me, she warned the House, she said that she takes no prisoners. And I think that applies to the Noble Lady Pigeon as well. And I think that's a real asset to our debates here. So I look forward to her next intervention. And also, of course, welcome the Noble Lord Grayling, who's not in his place at the moment. I'm going to have a quiet chat with him about the fact that if you had fewer tourists, you would actually need less nature recovery. But that's probably a job for another day. Now, on this bill, I must say, I do support the idea of public ownership. I think it's excellent that Labour has gone slightly back to its roots. And I think it's doing the right thing by taking back control as each of the railway contracts comes up for renewal. So that's good. Now, the Green Party opposed privatisation in the first place, and we don't have much criticism of the mechanics in this bill, given that it seems to be heavily based on the rail renationalisation bill championed by our former MP, Green Party MP, Caroline Lucas, more than a decade ago. So thank you for picking up Green Party policy, albeit 10 years later. Now, these contracts are expensive, and the train companies are already discredited. When rail was nationalised, we had 15% of trains running late, but at least the fares were rated as amongst the cheapest in Europe. Since then, the percentage of late trains has doubled, and rail users are paying the highest fares in Europe. Plus, of course, as the Noble Lord Berkeley pointed out, each franchise does its own thing, with passenger confusion over ticketing and websites and delayed compensation. So before finalising plans, perhaps the government could think about taking some advice from people who actually pay their way and buy tickets on a daily basis. For example, the man in seat 61, who might have some very useful advice on how to make things easier. Now, alongside this rise in fares, the taxpayer subsidy has grown from under £2 billion to around £12 billion. Taxpayers and fare payers are both thoroughly fed up with their money going into the pockets of shareholders rather than improving the service they get. Public ownership makes sense. But I don't understand why this impeccable logic only applies to railways, because surely the Noble Lady and the Minister's comments actually apply to all other forms of privatisation of essential services as well. In the next 5 years, for example, nearly all the big NHS contracts are up for renewal. So will ministers actually apply the same logic to them and save us money by bringing them back in-house? The NHS is paying £2.1 billion per year on PFI schemes. The NHS budget is expanding, and yet we're getting less back because of the growing role of the private sector. I hear a lot from this government and the last about value for money, but those rules go out of the window when we look at PFIs. Taxpayers have spent £80 billion on NHS PFI schemes that only got £13 billion of actual investment. That does not seem like a good deal. Now, public ownership of rail is a good thing, but what difference will it make to passengers? Now, hopefully it will enable the government, ministers, to directly reduce fares and have a real impact on traffic reduction. In the years between climate change becoming a recognised issue in the early 1980s and the husky-hugging era of Prime Minister Cameron, the cost of motoring fell while rail and bus fares rose rapidly. Season ticket fares are often 80% higher than they were before privatisation, and longer distance fares can be twice as high as they were. This is not the record of a country serious about climate change, and we have failed to reduce emissions from the transport sector. This government, like the last government, is telling us there's no money. But during my time on the London Assembly, which other members of your Lordship's House might remember, we worked with the Mayor on promoting the congestion charge and the ultra-low emission zone. That generated the extra revenue that helped to keep fares lower and provided some of the money needed to build new tube and rail lines. Politicians of all parties knew the value of having a public transport system that worked and was fairly cheap to use, but only a few of us were willing to raise that money for investment by saying that the polluter should pay more. In fact, there was a classic comment from the Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, who said the only people supporting his congestion charge were businesses in the city and the Green Party. Now, Portugal have just introduced a £20 monthly rail pass for all its services, and that's the kind of vision that we need here in the UK. We need from a publicly owned rail system. It would take ambition and it would take money, but we could make the polluter pay by finally taking the brake off the fuel duty escalator that New Labour introduced. This government has taken positive steps to give local authorities the power to regulate buses, so the next logical step is to give the metropolitan mayors a big say in how rail works with bus and tram services, to be the better option in large areas of the country. We need democratic control of the railways, not decisions driven by Whitehall and, even worse, by the Treasury. So privatisation of rail has given us higher fares and generated a fat profit for all the state-owned German and French rail companies who took advantage of UK taxpayers. So I congratulate Labour on bringing this to an end. But why not end the disastrous mistake of water privatisation that will cost £12.5 billion in this Parliament alone, only to pay shareholders and creditors, but still result in waterways full of faeces, agricultural runoff, other chemicals, drugs, paint, bleach, plastic? If water companies collapse, then we could buy them for pennies and run it ourselves. On public ownership of the energy system to deal with a huge jump in household bills, we could end the scandal of record-high standing charges that do nothing to discourage energy use and which hit the poor really hard. Rail companies have made a good profit, but British Gas has made a tenfold profit over last year, and the likes of BP and Shell have doubled and trebled profits. Public ownership could end those excess profits and bring down prices for consumers. The public can see these injustices and the way this system of privatisation eats up taxpayer cash and consumer monthly payments. It holds back public investment in our economy, and instead of new hospitals or railway rolling stock, our money buys new private jets for the super rich. The public wants more public ownership, and I hope this government starts listening to voters rather than lobbyists and party donors. So to sum up my speech, a mix of well done Labour, but why stop there?